nation will endure as it has endured.
Our long national nightmare is over.
Give me a break. That's a bunch of malarkey.
Hello, welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
I'm Chaz Jadalo.
Finally, it's Infrastructure Week, but will the money go to the right places?
Plus, America's murder rate is soaring and police are not keeping up.
Also this week, the story of the first woman to serve in the US Congress.
And I'm going to have heaps of barely comprehensible graphs on the economy, inflation, COVID, you name it. But first...
Just minutes before midnight last Friday night, the US House of Representatives finally voted to pass a bipartisan infrastructure bill, almost 3 months after the Senate voted 69-30 in favour of the big spending bill. It was much closer in the House.
On this vote, the yeas are 228 and the nays are 206. The motion is adopted.
13 Republicans joined with 215 Democrat yes votes, while 6 Democrats gave it the thumbs down. Former President Donald Trump's failure to secure an infrastructure deal during his 4 years in office became something of a running joke about the number of times he announced Infrastructure Week. Well, he was far from pleased that it was Republicans that made up the numbers to pass this bill, taking particular aim at Republican Senate leader Mitch McConnell.
Why is it that old crow Mitch McConnell voted for a terrible Democratic socialist infrastructure plan and induced others in his party to do likewise, when he was incapable of getting a great infrastructure plan wanting to be put forward by me and the Republican Party?
And he's not the only one peeved at the Republicans, John. As it turns out, the anti-Trumpers down at National Review were with Trump on this one. Phil Klein wrote, "Every Republican who voted for this monstrosity who is not already retiring should be primaried. Those who are retiring should be shamed for the rest of their lives." Bit harsh. Marjorie Taylor Greene pulled out the quote marks when she said, "These were the Republicans who helped pass Joe Biden's communist takeover of America." I'm not sure communism is roads funding, but anyway. Then she listed every one of the miscreants. Now, she didn't say what to do with those 13 Republicans, but some activists got the message loud and clear, and then they left some very loud and clear messages on the Republicans' answering machines.
Traitor. That's what you are. You're a piece of traitor. I hope you die. I hope everybody in your family dies. You piece of trash mother. Voted for dumb ass. You're stupider than he is. And he can't even complete a sentence. You dumb mother. Traitor. Piece of mother. Piece of trash. Hope you die. Hope your family dies. Hope everybody in your staff dies. You piece of traitor.
Now, that message was clearer before it was bleeped.
I don't think President Biden should be talking like that to anyone personally, Chaz.
Look, I'm just pleased to see so much passion about infrastructure, John. Look, there's even been talk of stripping committee assignments from the 13 Republican lawmakers to punish them for their bipartisanship. Look, I think these Republicans are angry because the Democrats only have a 3-vote majority and 6 Democrats voted against this bill, the so-called squad. So they probably think these Republicans are responsible for Biden having a win. I'm not sure that's true, though. There's every chance that if the Democrats had needed the squad to vote for the bill, they would have. Ayanna Pressley, for instance, waited to make sure the infrastructure bill had already received enough votes to pass before she voted against it. So I think all this anger, kind of pointless, but I guess it passes the time.
Yeah, and it's all about pandering to your own constituency. They're all doing it for their own reasons. But this House vote came after those progressive Democrats agreed to untether the infrastructure bill from that even larger social spending package, which is still expected to result in a reconciliation vote. Assurances were given that that too will pass in the next few weeks, although that is a little bit like releasing a hostage on the promise that the cheque for the ransom money is in the post.
Especially since the moderates left themselves such obvious outs if they wanted to take them. For example, in their deal, they explicitly said they would support the social spending package as long as they received fiscal calculations from the Congressional Budget Office that supported the White House's financial estimates. But modelers Penn Wharton have already found that the framework costs $1.87 trillion, $120 billion more than projected, and it raises $1.56 trillion worth of revenue, about $500 billion less than projected by the White House. If the CBO agrees with those numbers there, it could be fatal for the bill. Also note, if you take out all the budget shenanigans, Penn Wharton said the spending would be more like $4 trillion. And you know who hates budget chicanery? It's the guy who isn't part of this promise. The guy who's made no promises whatsoever and who the entire bill depends upon, this Manchin fellow. That CBO estimate next week could be massive, John.
Yeah, over to you, Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden. But after months and months of bad news and bad polls, President Biden was in a very clearly buoyant mood this week about securing a deal that has eluded several of his predecessors.
We did something that's long overdue, that long has been talked about in Washington, but never actually been done. The House of Representatives passed an Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. That's a fancy way of saying a bipartisan infrastructure bill, a once-in-a-generation investment that's going to create millions of jobs, modernize our infrastructure, our roads, our bridges, our broadband, a whole range of things.
So, as you'll recall, once a bill passes the House, it goes to the President's desk to be signed into law. And after months and months of underscoring the absolute urgency of this bill, President Biden wasted no time in immediately leaving it sitting there on his desk unsigned. Probably until Monday, it looks like, when Congress is back in DC and he can hold one of those big signing ceremonies and hand out lots of souvenir pens. Because, as White House Deputy Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre points out, this is the
largest ever federal investment in public transit, clean energy transmission and electric vehicle infrastructure, and clean drinking water. It delivers for the American people by rebuilding our roads, railroads, and rail cars, bridges, buses, ports, and airports, all while creating good-paying union jobs.
And Transport Secretary Pete Buttigieg, who gets to spend a large amount of this loot, was
so thrilled, so excited.
In fact, he was
excited with an exclamation point.
And the former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, turned presidential longshot, turned highest profile cabinet member, certainly seemed to be excited as he enthused about what this bill would mean, Chaz.
Well, I think it's worth celebrating, John. Congress was actually functional for once.
They did a thing.
Let's celebrate in the old-fashioned way, shall we? With an exhaustive, super dry segment detailing what the hell this bill actually does.
Yes, here's the deal.
Well, let's dive right in and find out what's in this $550 billion, this $1 trillion, this $1.2 trillion. If you guys make up your mind, one of these is more than twice the size of the other one. They're not even close. They're going... Oh, okay, all right. Apparently, the little one is the right one. That's the accurate one, the small one. There are only apparently $550 billion in entirely new investments in this bill. But nevertheless, senators, for some reason, like to refer to the bill as a $1.2 trillion package because, okay, they're also counting funding that's normally allotted each year for highways and other projects. So this is actually a $550 billion bill. It's added to the standard highway funding bill. That's what's going on. Okay, so what's actually new? Well, 660,000 jobs over the next 4 years is apparently new, and they're supposedly being created out of the following programs. This here is a summary of almost all the new spending, and it starts with $110 billion in extra funding for roads and bridges. According to the White House, 20% of the nation's highways and main roads, as well as 45,000 bridges, are in poor condition. So this money is on top of the regular highway funding to fix this. We're talking $40 extra billion just for the bridges alone. They call it the single largest dedicated bridge investment since the construction of the interstate highway system. That's back in the 1950s. There's also $16 billion for major projects that would be too challenging for traditional funding programs, whatever that means. I don't know what else is in there, to be honest, except I know there is $3.5 billion earmarked for West Virginia. Seems like a lot for West Virginia. How did that happen, I wonder? I've got no idea. Next up, there is $66 billion for railroads. We're talking the largest federal investment in passenger rail since America's federal rail service, Amtrak, was founded 50 years ago. Most of that money is indeed going to Amtrak for maintenance, lucky Amtrak, but some of it is going to intercity rail expansion, including some high-speed rail. I'll believe that when I see it. Next, there is $39 billion for public transit. That's going to make public transport more accessible for disabled and elderly. And importantly, they're going to be modernising it as well. The Department of Transportation has found about 40% of buses, 23% of rail assets are in marginal or poor condition, with $98 billion of deferred maintenance and replacement. So I suspect that money is going to get used, as will the money upgrading ports. $17 billion, about half of which is going to infrastructure upgrades, and the other half is going to the Coast Guard and ferry terminals. It's not going to help the current supply crunch, I'm afraid, but it might help the next one. $25 billion is also going to airports to improve runways, gates and terminals, although presumably since that's airport money, it will probably only buy them 2 magazines and a burger. $5 billion of that is going to be going to air traffic control towers as well. This bit got a bit of play at Glasgow this week. $15 billion is going to electric vehicles. Half of that's going to be going to building new charging stations, because America currently has about 43,000 charging stations for electric cars. Not enough. According to the White House, this is going to get them to 500,000 charging stations. The other $7.5 billion will go to buying zero or low emission buses and ferries. There's $11 billion for road safety as well. You probably don't need me to explain that to you because you're not idiots. This road safety. To utilities, $65 billion is for power infrastructure. $5 billion of that is for grid reliability and resilience, which is a fancy way of saying updates to old power lines and cables to ensure that the power grid's not hacked. Sounds like a good idea, given that it was hacked quite recently. There's $3 billion for smart grids. Now they're necessary for renewable energy, so that's good. $6 billion for batteries infrastructure, like we're talking local battery manufacturing, mineral processing, that kind of stuff. $6 billion for subsidising nuclear reactors, which might otherwise close down soon, because America needs to hold on to whatever zero emission energy can at this point. Not doing real well. And there's also funding for carbon capture and clean hydrogen, which are both ways of badging fossil fuels as environmental. How did that work its way in there, I wonder? Yeah, that's right. As Australians, we know that no super expensive infrastructure plan is complete without broadband. And the White House reckons that 30 million Americans still don't have reliable internet access. So they're spending $51 billion on rolling out broadband to rural and tribal communities, and $14 billion lowering the price of broadband for the poor. They're going to do that by requiring federal funding recipients to offer a low-cost plan. And now the big one, as far as I'm concerned, which is $55 billion for water infrastructure. I know that sounds sexy, yeah. Look, what that means is $15 billion to replace lead water pipes. And I mean all lead water pipes. I'm not sure if you remember what happened in Flint, Michigan a few years back, but lead poisoning in the water supply can lead to behavioural and learning problems, as well as lower IQ, seizures, coma, even death. If this bill sorts out lead pipes once and for all, finally, that alone could make it worthwhile. But they're also throwing in $10 billion to decontaminate what they call PFAS spills. PFAS are chemicals derived from Teflon manufacturing and firefighting foam that are also causing serious medical havoc in America at the moment. So this all is a good area. Also handy is $47 billion to go into resilience. And what does that mean? More protection of critical infrastructure from cybersecurity attacks, as well as protection against flooding, fires, erosion, droughts, all the climate change stuff. Okay? Last year alone, the US faced 22 major extreme weather events, costing combined nearly $100 billion. So I imagine we can expect a lot more of this kind of funding from now on. Finally, we've got $21 billion for removing pollution from the soil and groundwater, and $8 billion for what they call Western water infrastructure. It's drought-proofing places like Arizona, otherwise known as the Bribing Kirsten Cinema Fund. As far as paying for all this bribery goes, $210 billion is supposed to come from unspent COVID relief money, and $53 billion is supposed to come from unspent COVID unemployment benefits. And then there's a few other trickier ways of scrounging money. I'm not going to go into any of those because the independent scorekeeper, the CBO, largely rejected them. That's why the CBO projects a $256 billion deficit over 10 years from this bill. We'll see how that works out. Anyway, enough of that. Now let's move to the reconciliation bill.
Jesus Christ, must you?
Which I might save for another week or two, John.
Yes, here's the deal.
But look, even with around $1 trillion, give or take, to spend, some tough decisions have to be made about where exactly that money will be spent. One of the guiding principles is the Biden administration's Justice 40 initiative, which mandates that at least 40% of the overall benefits of federal programs have to go to the most disadvantaged areas. This week, Transport Secretary Buttigieg talked about some of the ways that infrastructure has been used in the past to segregate and disadvantage some racial groups.
If a highway was built for the purpose of dividing a white and a black neighborhood, or if an underpass was constructed such that a bus carrying mostly black and Puerto Rican kids to a beach, or it would have been, in New York was designed too low for it to pass by, that obviously reflects racism that went into those design choices.
A really fascinating insight, one which was dealt with in a typically thoughtful, nuanced way from the voice of reason, that is Tucker Carlson on Fox News.
It's possible the overpasses that Buttigieg referred to are actually drawbridges manned by vigilant bigots with binoculars. Here comes the Puerto Rican bus. Lower the overpass. You may laugh, but in a systemically racist country, it's entirely possible. And we don't know exactly what's happening here, but we agree with Pete Buttigieg 100% that it's morally wrong. It's not who we are. So thank heaven he's got $1 trillion to get to the bottom of the racist road problem.
I guess we better play the sting. Well, joining us is Professor Joan Fitzgerald, an expert on urban and public policy from Northeastern University in Massachusetts. Professor, welcome to Planet America.
Thank you for having me.
So we've been hearing all this talk this week about racist roads, but can you give us a sense historically, Professor, as to how infrastructure was used to create or reinforce racial segregation in American cities, and the extent to which that was a deliberate act as opposed to that's where they just so happened to build that highway?
You have to go back to the 1930s to a process called redlining, where the federal government, along with local government real estate agents, deliberately created red lines around neighborhoods where Blacks could not buy into. And then you had government programs to help people buy homes that they were not eligible for. So that's the first thing that happened. And then in the 50s, when we invested a lot through the highway bill in 1956, and also through urban renewal programs, these highways were deliberately located to cut off or isolate those neighborhoods. Now, you might say, oh, they went through white neighborhoods too. Some did, that's true. But if you look at what was called slum clearance from urban renewal, it was also referred to at the time as Negro removal, with a deliberate attempt to move people out.
So is it possible to estimate the kind of social and economic impacts that infrastructure segregation has had on those who were kept separate from the rest of the community?
If we look at wealth accumulation in the United States, I'm sure it's the same there. Anywhere, for most families, it's your house and the appreciation of your house. So if you're cut out of the housing market, then all that generational wealth accumulation doesn't occur. So that's one aspect of it. If the highway isolates the community, it's harder to get to jobs. And that has been demonstrated as well in terms of your access to economic opportunity is lessened. But there's even more to the story than that. So isolating off with highways, and there's amount of pollution associated with that, with small particulate matter. But then you had the location of polluting uses such as incinerators, garbage transfer stations, wastewater treatment plants. And so all these polluting uses combined with the highway created an environment that was very polluted. And so it's not surprising that you see higher rates of asthma, heart disease, cancer in these neighborhoods.
Looking at the infrastructure bill, Professor, is the federal government, in your view, ready to implement this much infrastructure spending this quickly in an effective manner?
I think so. There are so many projects, just for example, taking the bridges that need to be rebuilt. That can happen pretty quickly. There's elements of, the water infrastructure, getting lead pipes out. That can happen very quickly. So I think there are a lot of things in this infrastructure package that can be put in place very quickly. I don't think that's the problem. The problem is, that in the negotiations, so many things got cut out or reduced.
Finally, Professor, good infrastructure isn't necessarily attention grabbing. What do you think are the parts of this bill that the American people are most likely to notice in their day-to-day lives, and how long do you think it will take them to notice it?
I think people will notice when roads are being repaired, when bridges are being repaired, when electric charging infrastructure starts to appear, when their water pipes are being replaced. There's a lot in this infrastructure package that is very visible. And I think the key thing is that it has to be visible in cities. It has to be visible in rural areas throughout the country for people to realize that government can do something to improve their lives and is doing it.
Professor Joan Fitzgerald, thanks for taking the time to talk to Planet America.
Thank you.
An update for you now on developments in the ongoing legal and congressional investigations into major events, from the claims of Trump-Russia collusion during the 2016 election to the aftermath of the 2020 poll, including the pro-Trump violence at the Capitol on January 6th. The Democrat-dominated House committee investigating that attack issued more subpoenas for documents and testimony this week from some key Trump associates, including campaign manager Bill Stepien, campaign advisor Jason Miller, campaign executive assistant Angela McCallum, Trump attorney John Eastman, former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, and Bernard Kerik, the former New York City Police Commissioner. This group is believed to have been among the ringleaders in Trump's efforts to overturn last year's presidential election result, including those who huddled for several days at a command centre at Washington's Willard Hotel, set up to steer efforts to deny Democrat Joe Biden his victory. The committee has now issued 25 subpoenas, already hearing from around 150 witnesses. Meanwhile, the federal court judge Tanya Chutkan this week rejected Trump's attempt to block the House committee from gaining access to White House documents from his time in office, specifically visitor and call logs from around about January the 6th this year. Judge Chutkan wrote in her decision that Trump is arguing executive powers exist in perpetuity. However, she noted pointedly, presidents are not kings and the plaintiff is not president, and that Trump's assertion of privilege is outweighed by President Biden's decision not to uphold the privilege. So in simple terms, the judge is saying, Biden's president, you're not. Trump is appealing that ruling. Oh, and the election result, of course, as well.
Yes, that's not appealing. While we're talking investigations, the never-ending Durham Special Counsel investigation is starting to deliver the goods, kinda. This was the guy that Bill Barr, remember, appointed to look into the FBI's Russiagate investigation. A couple of weeks ago, Durham indicted a guy called, yes, Michael Sussman, that's his name, And that's what he looks like, just in case you see him on the bus. Michael Sussman was indicted for misleading the FBI when he presented them with some evidence alleging a Trump-Russia connection while supposedly acting like he was just some good government enthusiast when he was actually being paid by the Hillary Clinton campaign. Then this week he indicted Igor Danchenko, and that's what he looks like, just in case you see him in your dossier. Danchenko was allegedly the main source for the infamous Steele dossier, and now he's been charged with 5 counts of making false statements to the FBI. Specifically when he talked to the FBI about his sources for the info that he provided to the Steele dossier. For example, rather than receiving Kremlin intelligence from a respected professional, one of Danchenko's sources was a guy called Charles Dolan Jr. He's a lawyer who was a state chairman for Bill Clinton's 1992 and 1996 campaigns, and he was a volunteer for, you guessed it, the Hillary Clinton campaign. Danchenko sent him an email once asking for, quote, any thought, rumour or allegation, very high standards there, on the Trump campaign. He said that he was working on a related project against Trump. Dolan sent him some garbage, and then Danchenko passed it off to Christopher Steele as professionally sourced information from a Russian contact, and it ended up in the Steele dossier. Now, we've known for a while that the Steele dossier was extremely shoddy. What we didn't know was that it's extremely shoddy information that was frequently provided by allies of Hillary Clinton. That's new. And it's going to be interesting to see what else Durham digs up in the next, 10 years at the rate he's going.
Yes, it is all a little bit sus, man. Now, some COVID news for you, and increasingly the focus of this pandemic in the United States has shifted from hospital wards to courtrooms. A federal judge ruled yesterday against a Texas state ban on school mask mandates. A disability rights group successfully argued that the mask mandate ban discriminated against students with disabilities, many of whom have health conditions that put them at greater risk for severe illness or death, by forcing them to risk exposure to the coronavirus or have to stay home from school to avoid that. Meanwhile, a school mask mandate in Pennsylvania has been ruled invalid because the official who issued it lacked the authority to do so. So it's unclear what happens next there, but it could now be just left up to individual school districts to decide whether they will impose mask mandates or not. The biggest case, though, at the moment is probably the challenge to President Biden's order that more than 80 million American workers get vaccinated or submit to regular tests early in the new year. It was brought forward by 26 Republican state governors in 5 different appeals courts this week.
Well, today a federal appeals court temporarily paused the Biden administration's vaccine requirement for businesses with 100 or more workers. This puts on hold a requirement by OSHA that those workers be vaccinated by January 4th or have those employees get tested weekly and wear a mask. So, Chaz, that's on pause and it looks as though it's headed straight for the Supreme Court.
Yeah, the administration certainly tried to increase their chances in court. They've taken 2 months trying to get the wording right of this thing. They've given businesses another 2 months to comply, just to dot their I's, cross their T's. They've allowed for medical and religious exemptions. They've allowed exemptions for employees who don't work in a workplace. They're not requiring mask wearing from unvaccinated people who work alone in a room, or where the employee can show that the use of face covering is infeasible or creates a greater hazard. They're trying really hard here. Yet, the ultra-conservative Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals could not impose an emergency injunction on that rule quick enough. They said they had to because there are grave statutory and constitutional issues with the mandate. Grave constitutional issues? It doesn't even kick in for 2 months. Note, by the way, the 3 judges who wrote that were exactly the same 3 judges who reached out to prevent a district court from even holding a hearing for a preliminary injunction stopping the Texas abortion law, SB 8, from going into effect. So, yes, John, the Fifth Circuit Appeals Court is going to do their darndest to strike the mandate down, and then it will head to the Supreme Court. Meanwhile, as we head towards winter, new cases have stagnated at about 70,000 a day, hospitalisations at about 40,000 and deaths at about 1,200 a day, which is not ideal. Look, I'm not even going to go through the state's vaccinations graphic today. It's going to be a little bit...
Stop! Stop! He's already dead. Dad.
I'm going to bring the graph back for us all to get very smug about in the final week of the season. But here is an interesting vaccination-related graph. This is the cumulative COVID death rate for counties where more than 60% of people vote for Biden. And this is the cumulative COVID death rate for counties where more than 60% vote for Trump. And these are the counties in between. Literally every month, the red counties are pulling further away from the blue counties for deaths per capita. They're just not taking the hint. But I have two pieces of good news today to remedy that graph. One, Pfizer has a new COVID pill and it works really well. If taken early, it is 89% effective in reducing the risk of hospitalisation and death. Out of the 389 people who took it in the trial, there were only 3 hospitalisations and 0 deaths, compared to the 27 hospitalisations and 7 deaths suffered by the people who took the placebo. And best of all, the people in this trial were all high risk for hospitalisation due to health problems like obesity, diabetes or heart disease. So that is doubly impressive. The only problem is Pfizer only expect to be able to produce 180,000 courses of these pills this year. That's like 2 days worth of COVID in America at the moment. So help is on the way, but not quite yet. The second bit of good news though is that anti-vaxxers may not like vaccines very much, but they love Regeneron antibodies being injected into their veins. Well, guess what? You can use those antibodies as a vaccine. We already knew taking Regeneron before you catch COVID reduces the risk of infection by 81% for a month. Well, turns out that it protects you for at least 7 months. So now the anti-vaxxers have got no excuse, John. I'm just curious who's going to pay the $2,000 for each Regeneron treatment.
They'll say, it's a vaccine, I'm not taking it. The coronavirus pandemic in the United States has coincided with an epidemic of another kind, that of murder. The homicide rate in the United States rose by a staggering 30% in 2020, the largest increase at least since 1905, possibly ever, far exceeding the previous spike of 20% in 2001, which was driven by the terrorist attacks of 9/11, which claimed more than 3,000 lives.
In fact, it far exceeded every year, John. This has been the annual change in murders for the past 50 years. It's quite a stark difference last year. Now, to be fair, if we look at the murder rate per capita, it certainly rose in 2020, but not quite so much out of control. So you need to be careful which graph you pick here. Although that murder rate is up another 15% this year so far. So we don't know how far this trend will go quite yet. Interestingly, if we compare the change in murders with the change in violent crime, they've mirrored each other in the past up to last year, but now not so much. Violent crime stayed down while murders took off. So it's all a bit of a mystery.
Yeah, at the same time, Chaz, according to FBI data, the percentage of murders that were solved last year, the so-called clearance rate, fell from 61% down to 54%.
And you know I've got a graph. Here it is. There's the graph. Quite a stark drop-off, actually. The lowest clearance rate on record, they say. And while 63% of murders were solved for white people, the clearance rates were even lower for racial minorities. 48% for Hispanics and 46% for black people. So there are a lot of questions to be asked here, John.
Let's try and get some answers as well. For that, we're joined by Jeff Asher. He's one of America's leading crime data analysts, and he's with us from the Big Easy of New Orleans. Jeff Asher, welcome to Planet America.
My pleasure.
So, Jeff, to what extent would you say this is simply cause and effect? The more murders there are, the more difficult it is to have a high clearance rate because you only have finite resources in police departments that are trying to solve these cases.
Well, unfortunately, the answer is sort of a yes, in that there are more murders, and it's fairly certain that the increase in murders is driving the falling of the clearance rates. But also in a lot of places, especially in big cities, you're seeing pretty dramatic decreases, which is also contributing. So while police in the US appear to have solved more murders last year, they didn't keep up with the number of murders that occurred, the number of additional murders that occurred, which led to the decreasing murder clearance rates. And then you got a bunch of places. New York City went from about 85% reported clearance rate in 2019 to somewhere about 45% last year. So not just that there was a decrease in the increase in the number of murders, but there was a decrease in the rate at which they were solving them and the number of murders that they were solving. A bunch of other cities reported really miserably low murder clearance numbers and also had high murder numbers, which leads to this really dramatic decrease in the national murder clearance rate.
So, Jeff, are you saying that in reality it's not true to say that they are solving fewer murder cases than they used to, but when they say it's the lowest clearance rate on record, that's just reflecting a wrinkle in the maths?
That's correct. They're solving more murders, but percentage-wise, they're only solving a handful more murders relative to what they were solving in previous years, while we had a 29% increase in the number of murders. So we had a dramatic increase in the number of murders and a much smaller increase in the number of murders that were solved. Basically, 15 to 20% of all murders are going to be basically self-solvers or ground balls, where the police don't really have to do anything or do much. They walk in on a husband with the knife is bloody over the body of the wife. They catch the murder in broad daylight on surveillance camera, and there's no masks, there's no attempt to hide it. It's obvious what happened. That's 15 to 20% of murders. So almost by happenstance, if murder increases substantially, you're going to get more murders solved just because you're going to have more of these easy to solve murders, but they didn't increase quite as much in terms of the number solved relative to the increase.
And Jeff, is it possible to quantify the COVID effect in all of this and the extent to which this also reflects the fact that police forces had high levels of infection, people being furloughed and so on? They're unable to investigate these murders.
That's a good question. And there's no way to remove the pandemic from anything that happened. There's the stresses that led to last year's increase, both in terms of the stresses specifically from the pandemic, stresses from the police legitimacy crisis that erupted after the murder of George Floyd, the stresses of depolicing, of officers pulling back in a whole bunch of cities that we have evidence, the stresses of fewer officers being on the streets because we know that the number of officers declined in a whole bunch of places. These are all interwoven with the pandemic, but I think it's also too simplistic to blame the pandemic per se. That there's no evidence that because of pandemic related effects that there was a decrease in the number of murders that were being solved. There's no evidence that officers had less tools at their disposal to solve murders this year or last year relative to previous years. It's just that there were fewer murders that were solved. New York being a good example, reporting in the first quarter and the first 4 or 5 months of the year, a very high murder clearance rate in the 50, 60, 70, 80% range for each month. And then in the second half of the year, plummeted to where they get to a 45% overall range. So was that the pandemic? Yes, in that the pandemic caused or contributed or had some impact on a lot of the potential factors that led to the increase in murders. But it's not clear that the pandemic was specifically responsible for murder clearances going down.
Now, Jeff, presumably police go to a lot of trouble to solve murders. So if clearance rates are 50-50 or even lower in some cases, how low are some of the clearance rates for other crimes?
Well, they're much lower. You tend to get murder clearance rates for things like burglary in the 12 to 15% range. Sexual assaults and rapes and robberies and aggravated assaults tend to have higher. The violent crimes tend to have higher clearance rates. But there are places like New Orleans, where I'm from, regularly reports low teens, high single digits in terms of rape being solved, in terms of the percentages of rapes being solved. A whole bunch of places like Oakland, I know, has 4 or 5% of auto thefts every year that are solved there. So it depends on the city and it depends on the crime. Violent crimes tend to have higher clearance rates than property crimes. Property crimes can waver from 10 to 15% up to the 20 to 30% range. It really depends on it. The actual number and percentages of some of these crimes is going to be really ridiculously small in a lot of cases.
Now, you've mentioned a couple of times now how difficult it is to get good data on crimes, even murders. Why is that? I would have thought that would be the kind of thing that the government would throw a lot of money and effort at.
One would think, but it's just not the case. It's something that we have designed a crime data collection system based in the 1930s is when it started, and it expanded to be national in the 1960s, and it just hasn't met the 21st century. They're switching to a new crime data collection system, which in theory will give better details on a sort of on a granular level, at the city level, at the agency level, at the state level, but won't do as good of a job at the national level because not every agency has bought into this new system and they're stopping the old system. So this new system called NIBRS, agencies are supposed to be submitting to it, but only half of agencies nationwide submitted last year via NIBRS. So you're going from data on 90% of agencies to data on 50% of agencies. It's certainly something that you'd think that the US government would put more resources into. Something like baseball, where they measure everything that happens on the field, every inch, every blade of grass that moves, they're essentially measuring. That should be the type of data collection system that we're looking for in crime. Not every American would agree, but I would argue that our crime trends are more important than our baseball trends, but we do a worse job of evaluating crime than we've ever done with baseball.
Jeff Asher, good to talk to you. Thank you very much for being with us on Planet America.
My pleasure.
105 years ago this week, the first woman was elected to serve in Washington, D.C. Yet more than a century later, women remain significantly underrepresented in the American Congress. It's the evening of April 17th, 1972. Millions of viewers are settling in to watch The Dick Cavett Show on ABC TV America. Cavett's a bit more cerebral, an offbeat alternative to the rival Tonight Show with Johnny Carson.
I was there the other day. They're tearing down part of your old neighborhood.
This is not just a coincidence, you know.
Can you remember when you realized that it was inevitable that you would split up?
I wouldn't, no.
First,
no. It's
was
like
there anyone?
saying, did you remember falling in love? Not quite, no.
1972 is also an election year. Republican President Richard Nixon is running for a second term, and Democrats are trying to pick their candidate. South Dakota Senator George McGovern is riding a wave of opposition to the Vietnam War, and on April 17, he's won the caucus election in Idaho. Within a month, he'll be on an unstoppable march towards the presidential nomination.
We have won a great victory today. There's no question about that.
The final guest on The Cavett Show on this spring night is a 92-year-old woman named Jeanette Rankin.
Will you welcome, please, Ms. Jeanette Rankin.
She's advocating for a change in the way that Americans elect their presidents. She says scrap the primaries and the Electoral College, make it a direct election with an Australian-style preferential ballot.
There aren't more than 15 or 20 who really want to be president, and let them all run. And everyone votes for their first choice, their second choice, or their third choice, or the fourth, and so on.
Jeanette Rankin knew a little something about voting more than half a century earlier. Before women in America could even take part in presidential elections, she became the first woman to be elected to Congress. A social worker and campaigner for women's suffrage, Jeanette Rankin was born in the Montana Territory in 1880, just 15 years after the end of the Civil War, fought in part over the abolition of slavery and granting black men the right to vote. Growing up on a farm, Jeanette Rankin was expected to do everything her brothers did, and she did. Come election day, she didn't understand why they could cast a ballot, but she could not. Unusually for her time, Rankin never married. By her mid-30s, she graduated from university and led the successful campaign for women's suffrage in Montana in 1914. 2 years later, she ran for one of Montana's 2 House seats on a platform opposing America becoming involved in the First World War and supporting the right of women to vote nationally. And she won. On April 2nd, 1917, Jeanette Rankin was sworn in as the first female member of the United States Congress. On the very same day, Democratic President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war against Germany.
The world must be made safe for democracy. Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberty. We have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest, no dominion.
Jeanette Rankin was one of just 49 members to vote against war, an unpopular decision that would cost her re-election 2 years later, but not before she opened debate on a constitutional amendment granting universal suffrage to American women. 2 decades after that, as America again resisted entering a war against Germany, Jeanette Rankin was re-elected by Montanans. The first ever woman in Congress was now one of 10. Within months, Germany's ally Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and another Democratic president asked Congress to declare war.
No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
And when Congress came to vote on Roosevelt's war resolution, there was just one vote against it. Congresswoman Jeanette Rankin of Montana. That decision would once again cost her re-election. By the 1960s, Jeanette Rankin was an icon of both the anti-war and women's rights movement. She joined the March on Washington in support of civil rights and spoke out against America's escalation of the Vietnam conflict. In her 10th decade, she again considered running for Congress in 1972. That's why she was on the Dick Cavett Show, and she had something she wanted to say about the latest war and the power of democracy.
Today, we're facing an election, and my slogan now is governments make war. And the only way we can stop war is to have something to say about our government.
Jeanette Rankin died the following year at the age of 93. A bronze statue was unveiled in the Capitol building in 1985, where it still stands today. But consider this. 105 years after she became the first woman elected, 101 years after universal suffrage was achieved with her help, women still represent just 27% of all members of the United States Congress. On the economic front this week, it was a case of good news and bad news. First, the good news.
Our economy is on the move. This morning, we learned that in October, our economy created 531,000 jobs, well above expectations. We also learned that job growth over the prior 2 months, August and September, was nearly 250,000 more jobs than previously thought.
Added up, and Biden can now boast around 5.6 million new jobs have been created in the first 9 months of his administration, which is
a record for any new president.
Yeah, the unemployment rate fell 0.2% in October, down to 4.6%. Not quite the pre-pandemic levels of 3.5%, sure, but America's almost now caught up the jobs lost during the pandemic, about 4.2 million to go. Bear in mind, there's been some population growth during that period as well. So that's good news. Also good news, retail sales are looking really strong at the moment, which is part of the reason for the current supply crunch, by the way. Also, do you remember how Trump couldn't brag enough about how the stock market was performing under him? It was doing so well. Well, this is the stock market under Biden. Not bad, really. And yet, economic confidence right now is abysmal. This is the Gallup Economic Confidence Index, where America is only marginally more confident than they were during the depths of the pandemic. So what do you think's going on there?
Well, I've got a little bit of an idea about that, Chaz, because this was the bad news this week. Yesterday, Biden notched up another record, US inflation hitting a 30-year high in October, as consumer prices jumped 6.2% on the back of increases in energy, shelter, food, used cars and trucks, and new vehicles as well. Petrol prices went up over 6% in just a month. And that is the kind of thing that everybody notices when gas heads above $4 a gallon in the United States. There it is in lights on every main road of every town. Even though the Federal Reserve says this is just a short-term issue, they are now under increasing pressure to increase America's official interest rate, still stuck at 0.25%. And the question is, how soon will they do it? Inflation is also one of the arguments that moderate senators like the debt hawk Joe Manchin are using to keep trimming back that social spending bill, Chaz.
Yeah, look, it's getting harder and harder to write this off as a temporary blip, I suspect. These here are the monthly changes in the CPI. And have a look, they look like they were going down, but they're not heading in the right direction now. There's also an increasingly broad range of products experiencing substantial price hikes. John mentioned a few. Look at this, 50% hikes on energy prices over the last year, 25% hikes on used cars and hotel rooms, 10 to 20% hikes on meats and proteins of all kinds, 15% hikes on white goods and furniture and so on. Worst of all, inflation is starting to eat into the gains that workers have been enjoying in their pay packets. Real average hourly wages have now fallen 1.2% in the last year. Real average weekly earnings have fallen 1.6%. And for some people, they would have fallen a whole lot more. This is part of the reason that, according to CNBC, inflation now ties with the coronavirus as the biggest concern for Americans, and it's racing further up. Like I mentioned last week, increasingly people are using the prices of goods to judge the strength of the whole economy. Not the stock market, not jobs, that orange line, the inflation rate. So you can see why Joe Biden really needs to get this under control, or at least to do some serious outreach. Maybe take a tip from the Bank of Jamaica. This is how you calm a nation down.
Too high, when I want it too low. No. When inflation's stable and predictable, that's the way to go. Cause when it high, people are gonna cry. When it's too low, the economy can't grow.
This is a message from Bank of Jamaica.
He's already got the sunglasses, John. Start singing, Joe.
Well, speaking of public outreach, time to bust some malarkey.
That's a bunch of malarkey.
And we have no fewer than 8 feet and 2 inches of Muppet malarkey this week, thanks to this tweet from Sesame Street stalwart Big Bird. As more and more 5 to 11-year-old American kids are being given shots, Big Bird tweeted this week, "I got the COVID-19 vaccine today. My wing is feeling a little sore, but it'll give my body an extra protective boost that keeps me and others healthy." What's wrong with that? Well, Texas Republican Senator Ted Cruz, who opposes vaccine mandates, did not approve of what he called government propaganda for your 5-year-old. And he then tweeted out a gif of Big Bird coming over to vaccinate your kids. But, as fan account Muppet History pointed out, there's nothing new about Sesame Street promoting vaccines, tweeting a photo of Big Bird's child immunisation campaign from 1976, under a Republican President Gerald Ford, by the way. But the main point that Ted misses is this. Big Bird's tweet was not about forcing children to get a COVID vaccination, it was about stopping children from being afraid. A 5-year-old doesn't decide whether they're going to get a COVID shot or not, but we all get to decide how much anxiety they're going to feel about it, particularly in a world where senators pick fights with puppets. It's malarkey, Chaz!
Also, what 5-year-old is cruising through Twitter? That message wasn't on Sesame Street. It was obviously targeted at parents. If their kids are going through Twitter, they've got bigger problems. Having said that, I don't care about Ted Cruz. I just have a message for one person only. Arizona State Senator Wendy Rogers. She tweeted that Big Bird is a communist. Now,
yellow on the outside, red on the inside.
Saying vaccines work is not communist, John. If the far right are going to call literally everything the Democrats do communist, they can at least take 2 minutes to learn what communism actually is. Please, that is malarkey.
Yes, and that's it for another trip to Planet America. Big show for you next time, though. We're due to talk to longtime Hillary Clinton advisor Huma Abedin, who, of course, was at the centre of some of the biggest foreign policy decisions in recent years, and whose former husband Anthony Weiner's laptop helped doom Clinton's presidential campaign.
Watch out for your DMs. You're going to find longer interviews and more stuff on ABC iView, Facebook and YouTube, and a new pet podcast in your favourite pod places there.
Bye-bye.